What if I told you China's real mountain secrets aren't locked behind gates? They're hidden in plain sight, in peaks people film but rarely understand. Across ridgelines and remote valleys, belief, ritual, and discipline shape mountains into living systems. Quiet places that still pull people upward for reasons deeper than the view. It starts in Mount Zhongnan, where the mountain hides its most private layer. Secluded temples and hermit paths tucked into the folds of the slopes, built for those who wanted silence more than attention. Then the scale rises at Mount Tai, where the secret becomes collective. Crowds gathering on the summit to watch the sky change at sunset, turning a climb into a shared ritual that's been repeated for generations. And the stakes climb higher in the Wudong Mountains, where the secret isn't just a place, it's a legacy. Taoist practice refined into the principles behind Tai Chi, built on balance, breath, and control that still shapes how people move today. What happens when a mountain isn't just climbed, but used? By faith, by tradition, by training. And how many peaks like these are still out there, filmed by tourists, yet never truly explained? Stay with this journey as we climb into China's hidden peaks, unpacking what's been kept quiet, why it endured, and what these mountains still teach the people who return. Mount Tai. A stone-backed massif rises from the Shandong Plain, and the secret is visible everywhere. Carved, climbed, and photographed, yet rarely understood as a working ritual system. Mount Tai stands just north of Tai'an, and its highest summit is commonly reported around 5,070 feet, tall enough to pull weather, light, and attention into the same narrow corridor. Because it was treated as the Eastern sacred mountain, linked with sunrise, renewal, and legitimacy, the mountain became a stage where power had to prove itself, not simply declare itself. Over the last 3,000 years, worship here evolved into the Feng and Shan sacrifices, an imperial rite honoring heaven at the summit and earth at the mountain's base. Instead of concentrating meaning in one shrine, the landscape spreads meaning across gates, stairways, and inscriptions, turning the ascent into a public script that repeats with every generation. This is why the crowds at sunset or dawn do not feel accidental. What looks like tourism is often an inherited form of participation. UNESCO's inscription in 1987 frames the same idea in institutional language. Exceptional value here comes from continuous worship and a cultural record embedded directly into the mountain. Even the geology supports the metaphor, with ancient rock mass rising abruptly from the plateau, making the summit feel like a threshold rather than a viewpoint. And that is the hidden layer in plain sight. Mount Tai does not simply offer a climb, it preserves a collective habit of meaning, repeated until it feels inevitable. A serrated white crest hangs above dark pine forests, and the skyline looks like a dragon's spine caught mid-motion between storm clouds and sunbreak. Yulong Snow Mountain, often called Jade Dragon Snow Mountain, rises just outside Lijiang in Yunnan, with its highest peak reaching about 18,360 feet. For the Nachi people, the secret is not the view but the presence. Ethnographic research describes Mount Yulong as sacred ground associated with the deity Sanduo, a protector feared and revered. That belief sits beside modern access, where the Glacier Park cable route lifts visitors to roughly 15,350 feet, turning a remote ice world into something reachable in minutes. At that height, the air becomes noticeably thin and oxygen scarce, and reports note many visitors rely on canned oxygen to manage the altitude. Below the snow line, towns like Baisha and the mountain's foothill villages frame the massif as a lived landscape. Fields, temples, and trail corridors under a constantly shifting weather ceiling. Down valley, Blue Moon Valley's pale, mineral-tinted water and cascades look almost unreal, which is why cameras linger there longer than they do on any interpretive sign. In the logic of mountain secrets, Yulong's hidden layer is plain to see. A single mountain functioning at once as sacred identity, fragile glacier terrain, and mass tourism, each reading changing what the same footage means. Cloud bands drift across steep ridgelines, and temple roofs flash in and out of view like signals, making the entire range feel less like scenery than a set of instructions. In northwestern Hubei, around Xi'an and Danjiangkou, the Wudong Mountains grew into a major Taoist center tied to Xuantian Shangdi, where belief was organized into place, route, and routine. What looks like a cluster of pretty buildings is actually a design system. Halls, terraces, and processional paths are positioned so practice becomes repeatable, day after day, without needing an audience. Instead of chasing height for its own sake, the mountain's sacred geography distributes meaning across the slopes, turning movement into a method. Enter, ascend, pause, correct, continue. Atop Tianzhu Peak, the Golden Hall, completed in 1416, stands as hard proof of Ming-era ambition, built to survive wind, fog, and the slow stress of altitude. The broader complex is formally recognized on the World Heritage Register, a diplomatic way of saying this architecture carried religious art and building technique across centuries of copying and refinement. Well-known crests rise to about 5,289 feet, and that elevation matters because shifting cloud, temperature swings, and slick stone surfaces quietly enforce patience and precision. Legends credit Wudong with internal martial traditions through the figure of Zhang Sanfeng, a cultural memory that persists even when the historical details are debated rather than settled. Zhangye Dansha. A band of painted ridgelines breaks out of the desert foothills, striped in reds and golds, as if the earth decided to reveal its layers all at once. Set in Gansu's Hexi corridor at the northern foothills of the Chilean Mountains, the Zhangye Dansha scenery spreads between Linza and Sunan counties, roughly 20 miles from downtown Zhangye. The protected geopark covers about 124 square miles, which is why the rainbow is not one hill, but an entire field of folded terrain. What looks like color for tourists is actually a geological archive. UNESCO's documentation describes multicolored fluvial lacustrine rock formations from the early Cretaceous that later underwent folding into the present landform. Dansha landscapes form when uplifted red beds are faulted and eroded. And here, wind and rain carve the tilted layers into sharp scarps, towers, and ravines that read like a cross-section. That is the hidden mechanism in plain sight. Most cameras capture painted mountains, while the real story is pressure, uplift, and time turning sediment into a visible script. Boardwalks and designated viewpoints keep foot traffic off fragile slopes, letting the spectacle stay accessible without erasing the very textures that make it famous. And when the site entered the UNESCO Global Geoparks Network in 2019, it effectively confirmed what the colors already argue. This is scenery built by deep process, not surface decoration. Potala Palace. A white and ochre fortress rises from a red hill like a mirage made permanent, turning bare rock into a skyline that feels both political and devotional. The Potala Palace stands in Lhasa at roughly 11,975 feet above sea level, where thin air sharpens every sound and every shadow. Its hidden layer is not a secret room, but a purpose. The building was designed to hold government, monastic life, and pilgrimage inside one vertical world. Construction of the modern complex began in 1645 under the 5th Dalai Lama, with major phases added later so the palace could expand from residence into a ritual engine. Records describing the structure emphasize how it was made to last. Sloped stone walls built thick, and copper reported as poured into foundations as protection against earthquakes. Below the walls, the devotion is equally physical. Pilgrims perform full-body prostrations, stretching face down so forehead, hands, and knees meet the ground as an act of humility and merit. The palace's meaning also carries modern weight, with the site formally placed on the World Heritage List, a public marker that preservation now shares the stage with prayer. And that is why it fits a mountain secret story so well. The spectacle is obvious, but the real mystery is how a single hillside structure can keep turning belief into routine day after day. A hard-edged granite skyline rises from the Shaanxi Plain, and the ridges look sharpened on purpose, as if the mountain was built to test resolve rather than offer comfort. Mount Hua lies near Huayin at the eastern end of the Qinling Mountains, roughly 75 miles east of Xi'an, close enough to history to feel like part of the capital's outer wall. As the western mountain among China's 5 great mountains, it was never only a landscape. It functioned as a sacred reference point where state, religion, and reputation could converge. The range is organized into a 5-peak shape, and that geometry matters because it turns the mountain into a system of thresholds, each crest acting like a separate chapter of the same story. Its highest point, the South Peak, rises to about 7,070 feet, high enough for weather shifts and exposure to become part of the meaning, not just the background. Taoist temples and shrines embedded along the routes anchor the mountain's quieter purpose, reminding visitors that Hua was used for cultivation and vows long before it was used for photographs. This is why the famous narrow paths in cliffside sections are more than travel folklore. The terrain forces pace, attention, and caution, turning movement itself into a kind of discipline. Modern tourism amplifies the spectacle, but the deeper story remains consistent. Hua's appeal comes from how little it flatters the viewer and how much it demands structure in return. In the logic of this video's hook, Mount Hua's real secret is simple and enduring. It is not a mountain designed to be consumed, but a mountain designed to shape behavior. Bailey Azalea Scenic Area. A sudden sea of color rolls over highland ridges, and the hills look painted on purpose, as if spring is revealing a hidden map written in petals. Bailey Azalea Scenic Area sits in Beiji, Guizhou, protecting an old-growth rhododendron belt that covers about 49 square miles of mountain terrain. The spectacle has a clock built into it. Official descriptions place peak bloom from late March to early May, when entire slopes shift from green to layered pinks, reds, and whites. What makes it feel like a secret in plain sight is that it is not a garden effect. It is a living forest system, sustained by the cool, humid plateau conditions of northwestern Guizhou. Local conservation notes highlight signature trees inside the reserve, including a famed azalea king, recorded at about 260 years old, known for producing nearly 10,000 blossoms in season. Rather than treating the blooms as one viewpoint, the site is organized into major scenic zones, often described as putti and jinpo, so the experience reads like moving through chapters of the same natural story. That structure matters because mass visitation can crush what people came to see, which is why managed routes and transport systems are used to keep foot traffic off fragile growth. In a video about mountain secrets, Bailey's real secret is simple and unusually rare: a landscape where time, climate, and tradition align each spring to make a wild forest look deliberately designed. A honey-colored cliff rises out of green foothills, like a stacked sheaf of grain, and the mountain seems to carry its real architecture on the outside. The Maijishan grottos sit near Tianshui in Gansu, positioned on the historic corridor that moved religion and ideas along the Silk Roads rather than only goods. Carved into a sheer rock face, the site holds about 194 caves, forming a vertical sanctuary where devotion was built into the cliff instead of placed on the ground. Records commonly date the earliest work to the 4th and 5th centuries, when Buddhist communities were spreading inland and needed protected places to teach, copy, and endure. What makes Maijishan distinct is its material choice and method. Much of the art is modeled in clay and attached to the rock, giving the figures a softness and intimacy that stone often cannot. Across those caves, sources describe more than 7,200 sculptures, with painted surfaces and murals turning narrow chambers into a continuous visual language of belief. Narrow, cantilevered walkways stitch the chambers together, and conservation reporting has emphasized how weathering and structural stress make preservation as important as visitation. The complex is formally listed as a component of the Silk Roads, the route's network of Chang'an-Tianshan corridor, which is a bureaucratic way of confirming its role in a much larger human system. And that is the hidden layer most footage skips. Maijishan is not simply caves on a cliff, but a mountain turned into an archive, where travel, faith, and time are preserved in plain sight. A wall of snow peaks rises at the edge of the plateau, and the ridgeline looks less like a mountain range than a closed gate drawn across the sky. Meili Snow Mountain stands in northwestern Yunnan near Dichin, on the border zone toward Tibet, where deep valleys and high relief make the landscape feel remote, even on a map. The range is best known for Kawagebo, its highest summit, rising to about 22,110 feet, a height that turns weather into a constant rule rather than a background detail. Because clouds build fast and storms can arrive without warning, the mountain has long carried a reputation for being difficult to approach and even harder to master in any simple sense. For Tibetan Buddhism in this region, Meili is not just scenery, but sacred geography, and pilgrim circuits treat the valleys and passes as part of a living ritual order. That spiritual use is the hidden layer most footage misses. The mountain is visited as an agreement, not as a trophy, with limits shaped by belief as much as by terrain. Modern climbing history reinforces the boundary, including the 1991 expedition tragedy that led to a continuing ban on climbing the main peak. Even from a distance, sunrise on the Golden Mountain effect, snow catching first light, can make the ridge feel staged, which is why it became one of Yunnan's most photographed dawn scenes. In the logic of mountain secrets, Meili's secret is restraint in plain sight, a famous mountain defined as much by what is not done there as by what can be seen. Mount Songshan. A long ridge rises from the Henan Plain like a stone compass, and the landscape seems arranged to measure meaning as carefully as it measures height. Mount Songshan sits along the southern bank of the Yellow River region and is remembered as the central mountain among China's 5 great mountains, a role that makes geography feel political. In older cosmology, this was treated as the center of heaven and earth. So the mountain was not simply admired, it was consulted, as if terrain could legitimize order. A populated valley around Dengfeng effectively splits the range into the Shaoxi and Taishi sides, turning one mountain into 2 faces, one quieter, one more ceremonial. That split helps explain the hidden layer in plain sight. Temples, academies, and observatory-style monuments cluster here because the mountain was used as a ritual and intellectual instrument, not a backdrop. UNESCO formalized that idea in 2010, describing Dengfeng's historic monuments as outstanding examples tied to ritual, science, technology, and education shaped by the mountain's central status. On the Shaoxi side, the Shaolin Monastery, founded in 495, anchors the most famous export of Songshan, recognized as the birthplace of Chan Buddhism and the cradle of Shaolin Kung Fu. Even the ground story runs deeper than the postcards, with the area often described as a textbook of geological history built by ancient mountain-making processes. The highest crest, Lian Tianfeng, rises to about 4,961 feet, and that abrupt lift is part of why the ridge can feel like a threshold rather than a viewpoint. Seen through the lens of mountain secrets, Songshan's real secret is that it functions like a system, aligning sky, state, and body, while most cameras only capture the surface. Highlands Stone Forest. A maze of gray stone blades rises from the plateau, and the spires lean like petrified trees, turning open ground into narrow corridors of shadow. Highlands Stone Forest sits on the Yunnan Plateau near Kunming, where long-term groundwater and rainfall dissolve limestone and widen fractures into a classic karst landscape. The distinctive shapes are the point: knife-thin pinnacles, fluted stone swords, and clustered towers that create a natural labyrinth with sudden courtyards and dead ends. Because the rock is exposed and the pathways funnel wind and mist, vegetation stays low and patchy, while local Saniyi tradition treats the area as cultural ground with stories tied to the stones. It looks like sculpture, but it is erosion doing patient arithmetic. That is the hidden layer in plain sight, not a single monument, but a whole terrain where geology, microclimate, and folklore keep reinforcing the same uncanny forest illusion. A knife-edged summit lifts above a sea of cloud, and the temples perched on its crest look less like buildings than a dare made permanent. Fanjingshan, Mount Fanjing, rises in Tongren, Guizhou, as the highest peak of the Wuling Mountains, reaching about 8,439 feet. Around that peak sits a protected landscape of roughly 219 square miles, where elevation and distance help keep entire forest layers unusually intact. That isolation is not just scenery. Official World Heritage materials emphasize endemics found only here, including the Guizhou snub-nosed monkey and the Fanjingshan fir. In Chinese Buddhism, the mountain is revered as a sacred seat of Maitreya, so height matters less than what the terrain is believed to hold. The most unforgettable proof sits on Red Cloud's golden summit, where two small halls face each other across a narrow stone bridge split by a deep cleft. Older temple histories describe cycles of damage and rebuilding, which quietly explains why devotion here reads as persistence rather than performance. In 2018, the site was placed on the World Heritage List, a formal way of stating that its biodiversity and intact subtropical forests are globally rare. That is the mountain's hidden layer in plain sight. One ridgeline carrying two stories at once, deep time ecology below, and belief balanced above a drop, refusing to be separated. Mount Zhongnan. A crown of terraces rises out of Qinling Forest, and the air feels tuned for incense, bells, and quiet vows rather than applause. South Wutai, often treated as the spiritual heart of the Zhongnan Mountains, sits in Chang'an District about 19 miles south of Xi'an, close enough to the old capital to stay within its shadow. Its name comes from 5 terrace-like peak platforms: Guanyin, Wenshu, Qingliang, Lingying, and Sheshen, so the mountain reads like a natural altar set in stages. Rising to about 5,538 feet, the ridgelines sharpen the weather and the mood, making retreat feel like a practical condition, not a poetic pose. Official travel histories note the area was formerly called Taiyi Mountain and was already revered in the Sui and Tang eras for imperial tours and pilgrimages. Within that larger landscape, sacred longevity temple, Shengsho Temple, stands out as the mountain's anchor, rebuilt again and again, yet still treated as a place where the mountain's identity is kept intact. That is the hidden mechanism in plain sight. The secret is not a single viewpoint, but a repeating system of halls, paths, and daily ritual that turns geography into practice. In recent years, the same sanctuary has been pulled toward the modern spotlight, with local authorities proposing a national 4A-level tourist attraction designation for the Zhongnan Mountain Nanwutai Scenic Area. And as modern reporting on Zhongnan's hermit culture shows, the mountain's private life still negotiates with regulation, proof that even hidden places remain connected to the world below. A long, forested escarpment cuts across the Shanxi Hills, and the cliffs conceal courtyards and temples, the way a bound book hides its chapters inside the spine. Mian Mountain sits near Jiashu in central Shanxi, where steep ravines, layered rock walls, and sheltered ledges make it natural for sacred spaces to be built inward, not displayed outward. The place is inseparable from the story of Jia Zitui, a loyal retainer in traditional accounts, whose refusal of reward became linked to the cold food custom and a lasting ethic of restraint. That narrative did not stay abstract. It shaped how the mountain was used, drawing later generations to mark the slopes with shrines, pavilions, and commemorative spaces that keep the lesson tangible. Even without naming every structure, the setting reads as architectural because cliff faces act like ready-made walls, and narrow ledges become corridors that guide movement and attention. Seasonal weather works as a quiet amplifier. Spring growth softens the rock, autumn color sharpens contrast, and winter cold makes the cold food memory feel less symbolic and more physical. Taken together, the geography and the legend fuse into one system. Ritual, remembrance, and landscape reinforcing each other until the mountain feels like a story you can walk through. A broad granite massif rises out of misty farmland, and the ridgelines stack into soft silhouettes that make the mountain feel older than the roads leading to it. Hengshan, Southern Heng, stands in Hunan near Hengyang, long regarded as the southern sacred mountain within China's 5 Great Mountains, which turned a regional peak into a national reference point. Its terrain is defined by rounded summits, forested slopes, and frequent cloud cover, a combination that keeps the atmosphere cool and damp for much of the year and gives the landscape a persistent temple mist mood. Because the mountain functioned as a ritual landmark, belief here tends to concentrate in a few anchor sites, with Nanyu Temple at the mountain's cultural center and processional routes that make arrival feel ceremonial. Over centuries, Buddhism and Taoism both took root on these slopes, so the mountain's identity became less about a single doctrine and more about a shared grammar of pilgrimage and seasonal offerings. The modern, scenic area framing adds accessibility, but the place still works best as a slow narrative. Stone steps, incense courtyards, and viewpoint ridges repeating the same theme of southern stability. When fog closes in, the mountain's strongest impression is not a single landmark, but the feeling of a sacred boundary that begins well before the summit. A white pyramid of ice rises above dark forests on the eastern edge of the Tibetan Plateau, and the peak looks close enough to touch while staying completely out of reach. Gonga Mountain, also known as Minya Konka, stands in western Sichuan in the Dakshui Shan Range, and a national survey reported its elevation at about 24,636 feet. Its location matters as much as its height. This is the King of Sichuan Mountains, an isolated giant that dominates surrounding valleys without the safety net of a broader Himalayan skyline. The terrain is a full vertical system, glaciers above, alpine pasture and forest below, with a snow line commonly placed around 18,000 feet, so climate changes read like visible bands on the mountain's body. That layered geography is why nearby areas on the east slope became famous for glacier scenery and geothermal features, where warm water and ice can exist in the same regional frame. Long before modern trekking, Tibetan cultural tradition treated the peak as sacred ground, which quietly explains why reverence and restraint often sit beside tourism here. Modern mountaineering history adds another boundary. The first recorded summit was in 1932, and the mountain's reputation has remained more severe than its photographs suggest. In this video's terms, the real story is not a mountain to conquer, but a landscape that forces a choice between spectacle and humility every time it comes into view. A green mountain wall rises out of the Sichuan Basin's edge, and mist turns its ridgelines into layers, like the landscape is withholding the final shape on purpose. Mount Ma sits in Sichuan near the city of Meishan in Leishan, and it is traditionally revered as the sacred mountain of Puxian, the Bodhisattva Samantabhadra. Its main crest reaches about 10,167 feet, high enough that weather and visibility become part of the mountain's daily rules, not just background atmosphere. What most footage misses is that Ma was never only a viewpoint. Official heritage documentation describes a Buddhist cultural landscape with a recorded history of over 2,000 years. Instead of concentrating meaning in one monument, the mountain spreads it across routes and elevations, where monasteries, ritual spaces, and quiet thresholds make the climb feel like a structured practice. Even the ground story runs deeper than the postcard, because the wider region is linked to the Permian Meishan volcanic province, tying the mountain's presence to ancient eruptions and deep time change. That fusion, religion organized into geography and geology visible in the mountain's bones, helps explain why Ma is filmed constantly, yet still poorly read by most viewers. In 1996, the Mount Ma scenic area, including the nearby Leishan Giant Buddha, was placed on the World Heritage List, formalizing what the long record of pilgrimage already implied. So the real pull of Ma is not a single dramatic moment, but a living system where climate, terrain, and belief keep producing the same quiet outcome: return, repetition, and endurance. A trio of red rock spires breaks out of the hillside like three stone chutes, and the gaps between them turn daylight into a moving corridor of shadow. Jianglang Mountain sits in Jiangshan, in Zhejiang's Kuzhou area, where low basins give way quickly to steep, isolated ridgelines. Its signature profile is the three pieces of stone, three main peaks aligned from north to south, commonly named Langfeng, Yafeng, and Lingfeng. The tallest peak rises to about 2,680 feet, but what matters more is how abruptly the rock lifts, making the mountain read like a single, sculpted gesture. Geologically, it is a Dansha landscape, where red beds were uplifted and then carved by weathering into cliffs, towers, and narrow notches that look designed from a distance. In 2010, it was added to the World Heritage listing as part of China Dansha, formalizing the idea that this is not just pretty scenery, but a representative landform record. Regional cultural writing also points out that earlier travelers, such as Xu Shaque, paid attention to Jianglang's unusual, steep, and miraculous profile, showing that the mountain's reputation predates modern tourism packaging. Even with simple viewpoints and walking routes, the experience stays remarkably consistent. 3 stone forms dominate the horizon, and everything else, forest, sky, weather, becomes a changing backdrop that proves how strongly geology can control what people remember. A forest of granite pillars rises through cloud and pine, and the skyline looks hand-sculpted, as if the mountain is revealing only the outline and keeping the details in mist. Sanqing Mountain sits in northeastern Jiangxi, near Shangrao, about 25 miles north of Yushan County, where the Huayu Range lifts abruptly out of the lower basins. The terrain's signature is concentration, fantastically shaped granite peaks and needle-like towers packed into a compact landscape, so a single ridge can feel like a whole gallery of forms. Its highest summit, Yujing Peak, rises to roughly 6,000 feet, and that elevation helps create fast shifts in visibility that make the same scene look different hour by hour. Official boundaries cover about 90 square miles, large enough to hold multiple forest belts and sheltered valleys, which is why the mountain reads as an ecosystem, not just a viewpoint. Culturally, the 3 main summits are associated with the Taoist 3 Pure Ones, which is a quiet clue to how the mountain has been used, less as a backdrop and more as a sacred reference point. It is formally inscribed as Mount Sanxingshan National Park on the World Heritage List, a restrained way of acknowledging that its scenery is inseparable from the landform processes that produced it. What often goes unspoken in casual footage is the mechanism behind the beauty. Hard rock, deep fractures, long weathering, and persistent cloud patterns working together until geology starts to look like design. A sheer green massif rises above Zhangjiajie, and the skyline feels engineered by nature. Hard cliffs, deep voids, and one opening that reads like a door cut into stone. Tianmen Mountain stands in northwestern Hunan inside Tianmen Mountain National Park, reaching about 4,980 feet, high enough for cloud, fog, and sudden weather shifts to become part of the atmosphere. Its defining landmark is Tianmen Cave, a natural arch about 431 feet tall, shaped by water and erosion, until the mountain acquired its most famous missing piece. What makes the place memorable is how the terrain forces a single visual grammar. Cliff faces compress the horizon, corridors funnel movement, and the arch frames sky like a ritual stage. Even the access infrastructure echoes that drama, with a mountain road built around 99 tight turns that makes elevation feel like a deliberate escalation rather than a simple transfer. Above the tree line, cliff-edge walkways and exposed ledges turn ordinary sightseeing into something more focused, because the landscape quietly demands slower pacing and better attention. Below the stone spectacle, intact forest and humid subtropical conditions support a dense, layered ecology, which is why the mountain can feel both lush and severe in the same frame. And when the arch is called Heaven's Gate, it is not just marketing, it is a name that fits a landscape built around thresholds, where rock, weather, and belief meet in one image. Red cliffs rise above a quiet river, and high on the rock face, empty ledges suggest that remembrance here was once suspended in open air. Mount Longhu sits in Yingtan, Jiangxi, within China's humid, subtropical Dangxia Belt, where red sedimentary rock forms peaks, cliffs, and canyon-like cuts. The landscape is essentially a geology lesson made scenic. Uplift exposed the red beds, and weathering and erosion carved them into steep walls and isolated forms. What made the mountain famous, though, is how completely religion attached to that terrain. Longhu is a major center for Zhengyi Dao, with institutions such as Shangqing Temple and the Celestial Master's Mansion anchoring its identity. Stories credit Zhang Daoling, the Han-era founder associated with the Celestial Master's tradition, with establishing early temples on these slopes, turning retreat into an organized lineage. Longhu also carries a darker, older signature. UNESCO's own evaluation highlights cliff burials and hanging coffins linked to ancient Yue culture from about 2,500 years ago. The cliffs even preserve a literary layer, with references to Tang-era poems and inscriptions cut into stone, so the mountain reads like a public archive as much as a sanctuary. Today, the experience tends to orbit the same corridor: river, red wall, temple courts, because the terrain naturally funnels movement and keeps the dramatic forms in constant view. And when Longhu was included in the China Dangxia World Heritage Inscription in 2010, it effectively formalized what the mountain has long demonstrated. Here, geology and belief are built into the same landscape.